Hello everyone! Today, I'm going over a budget commander deck that I've built around Pia Nalaar, Consul of Revival. As usual, I've designed this deck to list for less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, which will include our basic lands at 10 cents each, but that price doesn't include shipping or any other costs. So, Pia Nalaar, Consul of Revival, is a 2/3 legendary human artificer costing only a red and a white mana to cast, and gives thopters we control haste, and has us make a 1/1 thopter creature token with flying whenever we play a land or cast a spell from exile. I will admit, despite Impulse Draw and a few other effects playing into this commander, this deck took me a surprisingly long time to get functioning in the way I like. But let's do a quick game plan on how we expect to play with this deck. For the most part, we'll be wanting to cast many of our spells from exile to fill our board with a bunch of thopters. So, as previously mentioned, we're going to focus on a hefty amount of Impulse Draw in this deck, exiling cards from the top of our library to cast within that turn, or frequently till the end of our next turn, and as such we won't have nearly as many true draw spells as most decks would actually want. But Impulse is far from the only way that we can cast spells from exile, as there's a bunch of keywords that actually include exiling as part of their casting path. This particular deck will focus mainly on adventure spells, which exile after casting their instant or sorcery, but then you can cast their permanent spell from exile. And we'll have a handful of Foretell cards, which get exiled face down with their alternate casting cost for us to cast later. All these will help us to make a wide board of flying thopters that we'll intend to swarm our opponents with. But given that they're just 1/1s and will be a major component of our damage output, we'll also look to include a handful of spells to buff our thopters' power. But that's enough preamble, let's start digging into the 99 of this deck, starting with our ramp. For land-based ramp, we have Wayfarer's Bauble and Navigation Orb, the former tutoring a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, and the latter tutoring and revealing 2 basics and or gate lands, one going onto the battlefield tapped, and the other to your hand, of which I always recommend hunting for 2 gates. Gone Gate being the one that you would put onto the battlefield, as it lets our other gate enter the battlefield untapped the next turn, and then hunting for either Cliff Gate, Citadel Gate, or Boros Guild Gate for our hand, as they can tap for either of our colors, enter untapped due to Gone Gate, and let Gone Gate also tap for our Boros colors. Then for mana rocks, we have Mindstone and Prismatic Lens for generic mana, Marble Diamond and Fire Diamond for white and red mana, respectively, Felwar Stone, which is likely to tap for at least one of our colors in most games, Boros Signet, which converts 1 generic mana into a red and a white mana, Talisman of Conviction for generic, or you could get red and white for pinging yourself for 1. Arcane Signet, which will tap for any color we need. And then our only mana dork in this deck is Ornithopter of Paradise, which taps for any color we need, but if we have Pia Nalaar already out, it gains haste as a Thopter, so we don't have to worry about the summoning sickness and can get his mana right away. And the last card in this section is Beamtown Beatstick, which gives its equipped creature +1 power and menace, and has us make a treasure token if that creature deals combat damage to a player or battle. And given that we plan to have a bunch of already evasive flyers along with that menace buff, we should be able to frequently get value out of this equipment. But now let's go over the spells that put themselves into exile to cast later. To start with our adventure spells, we have Rimrock Knight, Cheeky House Mouse, and Fairy Guide Mother, each of which have their non-permanent spell buff one of our creatures, with some low-cost creatures to cast from exile to help fill our board with themselves and our thopters. And then Two-Handed Axe has an instant portion that gives one of our creatures double strike for the turn, and itself being an equipment that doubles its creature power when it attacks. Then Ardent Veil Tactician and Embereth Shield Breaker have interaction type non-permanent spells, the former tapping down 2 creatures and the other artifact destruction, stapled onto a couple of creatures. And to fill our boards even further, Ratcatcher Trainee and Horn of Valhalla have their non-permanent spells make creature tokens, the former making 2 1/1 rats that can't block and stapled onto a creature, and the latter making X 1/1 soldiers based on the amount of mana pumped into that spell. That being stapled onto an equipment that could buff pretty heavily in a go-wide deck, giving its equipped creature +1/+1 for each creature you control. We also have a few Foretell cards, which at sorcery speed can be exiled face down from our hand for 2 generic mana and can be cast later for its Foretell cost. The 3 I'll go over now are Scorn Effigy, a near vanilla 2/3, Cosmic Intervention, which we can use to keep a permanent around if somebody tries to destroy it, and Starnheim Unleashed, which we can use to get a few 4/4 Angel Warriors with Flying and Vigilance onto the field. But with that, let's move on to our Impulse Draw spells. Blazing Crescendo lets us buff one of our creatures +3/+1 for the turn while giving us 1 Impulse Draw, while Reckless Impulse and Wren's Resolve simply have you exile 2 cards which you can play until the end of your next turn. Light Up the Stage does the same, but can be cast for 1 red mana if an opponent had lost life the turn you cast it. And Ignite the Future and Inspired Tinkering exile 3 cards from the top of your library, which you can play until the end of your next turn. Ignite the Future also has Flashback, letting it be cast from a graveyard, and when cast this way, the exiled cards can be played without paying their mana costs, while Inspired Tinkering gives you 3 treasure tokens. Commune with Lava is an X-cost spell letting you exile the top X cards of your library to play until the end of your next turn. And Showdown of the Skalds is a saga that has you exile the top 4 cards of your library, which you can play until the end of your next turn, with the following turns of the saga letting you buff a creature whenever you cast a spell. Then for some repeatable effects, Outpost Siege lets you exile the top card of your library at the beginning of your upkeep, which you can play that turn if you choose cons when it enters the battlefield. And Belborka, Spectral Surgeon, also has you exile one at the start of your upkeep that can be played that turn, with Belborka's power being equal to the greatest mana value of cards put into exile that turn. And Valakut Exploration has you exile the top card of your library as a landfall effect, letting you play that card so long as it remains in exile. Then, if cards exiled with Valakut Exploration are still exiled by the start of your end step, they're put into their owner's graveyard, and Valakut Exploration deals damage equal to the number of cards put into the graveyard that way to each opponent. Then Naali, Sun's Vanguard, has you exile the top card of your library whenever one or more tokens you control attacks a player, and you can play that card any turn that you've attacked with a token. So nice that those cards aren't on a timer like most impulse type effects, and Nalia even gives our attacking tokens double strike. Then Lelia, the Blade Reforged, has you exile the top card of your library when it attacks, which you can play that turn, and Lelia gets +1/+1 whenever one or more cards are exiled from your library or a graveyard. Tectonic Giant either deals 3 damage to each opponent, or exiles the top 2 cards of your library, which you choose one, which you can play until the end of your next turn, whenever it attacks or it becomes the target of an opponent's spell. Then there's Grenzo, Havoc Raiser, which, whenever one of our creatures deals combat damage to a player, we can goad one of their creatures or exile the top card of their library, which we can cast until the end of the turn and spend mana as if it was any color necessary to cast it, which is great since Pia doesn't require the cards that we cast from exile to be coming from our own libraries, they just have to be exiled before played. And finally, since we should have a wide enough board state to help protect her, we have Chandra, Fire Artisan, a planeswalker with 2 loyalty abilities, both focused on impulse draw, either putting 1 or 7 cards into exile, though they have to be played the turn that they're exiled. And when loyalty counters are removed from Chandra, she deals that much damage to a target opponent or planeswalker. But now that we've gone through all of our impulse draw, I'd like to quickly detour and mention that we do have a few cards that provide actual draw since cards in the hand are still great. These are Idol of Oblivion, which lets us draw just for tapping it provided we made a token that turn, which we should be doing consistently. Welcoming Vampire, which, max once per turn, lets us draw whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under our control. And Lochiel, Clockwork Scholar, also once per turn, lets us draw a card whenever one or more artifact creatures enters the battlefield under our control, while preventing all combat damage that would be dealt to our attacking artifact creatures. And Aurelia, the Law Above, lets us draw a card whenever a player attacks with 3 or more creatures, and deals 3 damage to each opponent while you gain 3 life whenever a player attacks with 5 or more creatures. But now that we've talked about a bunch of ways to help us get Thopter tokens, let's start going over the spells that'll help make them more potent. First up is Steel Overseer, which can be tapped to put a +1/+1 counter on each artifact creature you control. Then Chief of the Foundry and Tempered Steel give our artifact creatures +1/+1 and +2/+2 respectively, though Chief of the Foundry won't affect itself. Master Tinkerer gives our Thopters and Servos +1/+1. And Inspiring Leader gives your commander the ability to give your creatures +2/+2, though you do need to be controlling Pia to get this effect. Jorkadeen, the Prevailer, gives our creatures +3 power so long as we control 3 or more artifacts, which should be easy to meet with our Thopters. And Felidar Retreat either lets you make a 2/2 Cat Beast creature token, or you can buff each of your creatures with a +1/+1 counter and give them Vigilance for the turn whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control. And finally, since we'll be likely attacking with a bunch of Thopters, Shared Animosity will let the swarm hit even harder as our attacking creatures get +1 power until the end of the turn for each other attacking creature that shares a creature type with it. Now there's a couple of cards that I'd like to quickly go over that don't fit particularly well into any chapter, but still work well in this deck. First up, Loyal Apprentice will give us even more Thopters, as if we control our commander, we make a 1/1 flying Thopter creature token that gains haste for the turn at the beginning of combat on our turn. And Wild Magic Sorcerer gives the first spell that we cast from exile, Cascade, of which Cascade is yet another keyword that has us cast spells from exile, so huzzah! Extra casting and extra Thopters. But now that we've gone through a bunch of the spells focused on our board, let's start looking at the spells we can use to interact with our opponent's stuff. First up is Swords to Plowshares and Path to exile a target creature. Generous Gift and Stroke of Midnight will let us deal with the target permanent, though the latter only non-land permanents, though at the cost of giving that permanent's controller a 3/3 or 1/1 creature token, respectively. Lightning Bolt and Nahiri's Warcrafting are damage-dealing instants, with Bolt dealing 3 damage to any target, and Nahiri's Warcrafting dealing 5 to a creature, planeswalker, or battle. But then we can look at the top X cards of our library, with X being the excess damage dealt by the spell, which we can choose one of those cards to exile and play that turn, with the rest going onto the bottom of our library in a random order. Darksteel Mutation can be a pain to deal with, as it enchants a target creature and turns it into a 0/1 indestructible insect that loses all other abilities, card types, and creature types. And Horn of Ghirapur is another thopter that can be sacked to keep a player who has dealt damage from Horn of Ghirapur from casting non-creature spells until our next turn. And finally, we have 2 board wipes, with austere command letting us choose 2 of 4 options, destroying all artifacts, all enchantments, all creatures with mana value 3 or less, or all creatures with mana value 4 or greater. And Doomscar simply destroys all creatures, but it also has Foretell. And while casting it from exile won't really help us with getting thopters since we'd be wiping our board as well, but this can help us keep our opponents on their toes when we foretell a card, since even if they played against this deck before, they won't know if we foretold a board wipe or say Scorn Effigy. But now that we've gone through all the spells in our deck, let's take a look at our land base. First up are the previously mentioned gate lands with Gone Gate, Cliff Gate, Citadel Gate, and Boros Guild Gate. And then we have a few land tutor lands with Shire Terrace, Promising Vein, and Myriad Landscape. The first 2 simply tutoring a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, and the latter tutoring 2 basics of the same type onto the battlefield tapped. Then for some dual tapped lands, we have Boros Garrison, a bounce land, Temple of Triumph, a scry land, and Furycom Snarl, a reveal land. Then Exotic Orchard is likely to tap for at least one of our colors, and Path of Ancestry and Command Tower will tap for any color we need at that time. Castle Embreth can be used to give our creatures +1 power for the turn. And aside from that, we'll fill the rest of this deck with 11 basic plains and 11 basic mountains. But now that we've gone through all 100 cards in this deck, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see here, this deck is currently listing right around $44.50 at the time of recording, which does include our basic lands at 10 cents each, but it won't include things like taxes, shipping, and the like. Now before I close out this video, I'd like to go over a handful of cards that you may wish to consider if you're wanting to build this deck with a slightly higher budget. Now Feshni can be a fun one, as when you cast a spell from exile, you can copy it and choose new targets for the copy, though if it's a permanent, it instead gains haste and is sacked at the start of the end step. Professional Facebreaker gives us a bit more mana to work with while also giving us a way to exile cards to cast. And Rose, Cutthroat Raider, can fairly consistently provide junk tokens, which we could use to exile even more cards to cast. And I've been debating a bit on Wild Wasteland since we skip our draw step, but instead we exile 2 cards at the start of our upkeep, which we can cast that turn. Passionate Archaeologist lets us deal damage while doing what this deck wants to do, as your commander gets to deal damage equal to the spell's mana value to a target player when it's cast from exile. Delayed Blast Fireball is a soft one-sided board wipe with a Foretell cost that can be straight cast to deal 2 damage to each opponent and creature they control, but deals 5 damage instead if foretold, and it would add to the mystery for our opponents on what's being foretold if added to this deck. And finally, Alabu, Ancient Witness, lets us ramp up the damage we do while letting us also clean up the top of our library a bit, as whenever one or more of our artifact creatures attack, Alabu deals X damage to any target and lets you scry X, with X being the number of tapped artifacts you control. But regardless, if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider dropping it a like, and maybe sub if you'd like more budget commander decks in your feeds. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.